Just to remind people where we're going in this Lenten study, I think we, as Esther started us off with this idea that God's house has many rooms, and there's this spaciousness where there's room for everybody in there. But there's also this call that there's no name but Jesus that can save us. No religion, no theology, no ideology, no philosophy, but only our hope is in Jesus to save us. And Jesus saves us, but he saves all of us. He saves us as an integrated whole, a people of place and time and a people of history. And in that, we can learn off each other. And that's a journey we're on in this Lenten studies. So I didn't put this Lenten studies together, but I'm incredibly supportive of it, because what I've loved is that Anna and Rebecca have deliberately gone to a whole lot of broad voices in our diocese and asked them to speak into our reality so we can learn off broad voices to hopefully better understand who we are in Christ. Now, I was surprised, actually, when I found out who our next speaker was, because our next speaker is Nick Young. Now, I've known Nick for years. He went to school with my Jenny, and we've been mates for absolutely years, and many of us will know that Nick does a lot of the property development stuff from our diocese. But who knew he's also a Lenten studies speaker? So let's listen to Nick's journey, particularly at the pivotal point around 40, where he started journeying into his deeper identity.
And it wasn't until probably after I had my first child, really, that sort of growing, that sense of wanting to explore and understand that other half of who I was, what that might look like out there and who that might be. And lots of encouragement from Philippa, a couple of interesting conversations with different folk really encouraged me to go on that journey. And it was when I was 40, so it was about 15, 16 years ago, that there's a whole story within that journey of meeting my father. But that's when I first got to meet him and connect with his family. The interesting thing around that is why my birth mum's family is Pākehā, and I was definitely brought up in a Pākehā environment, and was complete with that understanding of where I fitted into the world. My father's side has Māori and Chinese whakapapa as a predominant whakapapa through the whānau. So there was this whole world that opened up about who and what I was and where I had come from, which is interesting journey in Aotearoa from a Māori point of view, but also just that Chinese connection too, and what that meant being an early immigrant in this country. So it was an incredibly welcoming experience. I was very much adopted with open arms from my father's side, which was healing and beautiful and very Jesus in the sense of being accepted. And I think also from my Māori side, just our journey of engaging in our iwi and our hapū and our experience came a little bit later, and has really been opened up the last few years. And that experience has also been one of incredible welcome, incredible sense of belonging, and an incredible sense of coming home. And I think that's been a real highlight or a feature or characteristic of the journey of discovering this other part of my life, is that it has been very welcoming and very open. I think my picture of Jesus has expanded. I think there is a sense of the wonder and depth and creativity and intricacy and beautifulness of Jesus has sort of expanded and grown and been blown apart in a sense of there's an invitation to walk and be fully present in a whole different way of looking at the world. And I think that's just for me triggered the sense of, wow, the creativity of God, the depth of Jesus is huge, and you multiply that across the thousands of different cultures and being across the world, and it's just that moment of whoa. So I feel very privileged. I think that's a key thing that's come to. I'm very grateful for just a greater sense of how big and beautiful God's creation is, and the privilege it is to taste and be part of it in a slightly different way than I thought for 40 years. So I think that's been very important. I think while, you know, my Māori journey and in a sense heading home to our whānau, which is in Waikawa, so Te Āti Awa, so Taranaki originally, the migration down and spent the last couple of 100 years in Waikawa in the Sounds. There's always that little choice I've got to make to lean in, and I think that's similar with our relationship with Jesus too, isn't there? There's the open door, there's the warm embrace, there's the sense of belonging no matter what, even if you didn't know who they were for 45 years, but incredible sense of belonging and place. But there's always that decision that sits with me, and there's always a posture or attitude that sits with me is to lean into that and to go again and to be made available to engage and relate. And I think that's the same with our relationship with Jesus. There's always that response from us, and I think that is, that's been made really clear to me. That, making time for your new family, making time for this other world you inhabit, saying yes to some things, having to put other things down, and I think that's very much the same journey that we have with Jesus. I think that's been key, and I think a really interesting thing I was reading not that long ago, it was a letter that Bishop Hadfield had written to his brother back in England in about I think it was early 1840s, and he had popped over Orokawa, the strait there, Cook Strait, and was just astonished by Te Āti Awa, how hungry they were for the story of Jesus. And he was getting 700 to 900 people from, you know, our hapū turning up to listen. He was concerned for their physical well-being because of how focused they were and hungry they were for, you know, making sense of the spirituality and who they and amongst that. Which, and you think back to your legacy, and that's your tupuna, and that's your whakapapa, and I think that's also been really encouraging, my walk with my walk with Jesus, in the sense that that's been there for a long time. The thing around the abiding is, or a couple of key lessons that have come out of that around the abiding space, I think, and I think as an older person coming into a new cultural environment where you absolutely belong, which has been phenomenal, but you come in as a learner, and especially when you're looking a little bit older, and you're sort of assumed or expected to have you know, a level of competency or immersion or being, you know, it keeps you very humble, and it makes you listen really well. You feel very privileged to be in a space, but I think the posture towards humility and learning and absorbing and sitting is really useful when you get a little bit older. And I think in that space, just the sense of abiding and staying in your lane and in your place, and just being open to learn and be taken in a direction has been a really useful discipline, or a sense of how it's appropriate to respond in a space. So I think that's been really, really important, and good for me. And there's a sense of abiding around that. What we touched on before, just the discipline of choosing again, and always needing to choose. And we touched on that, but abiding in the vine and being connected, I think there is that sense of choosing choosing all the time to walk in a direction. Archbishop Don Tamihere, Te Pihopa Matamua, he puts out that word, or that challenge, that to search out the divine that is in us all, and to search out that bit of the divine that we hold. And I think whether that's as individuals, as hapū, as iwi, as a culture, the challenge to hunt for the divine in the other, and to nurture and to bring that out and to see it and identify it as part of that abiding story. And I think that's a great challenge and a great way to walk, is hunting that divine. I think that's really important. I think that's come out. And I suppose the last one on that abiding thing is actually just around communion. We do communion a lot as Anglicans, and that's a beautiful thing. And I think I was just thinking about what does that mean for me at any given point. And I think it is all about abiding, in the sense that we go and we take the bread, and that is our energy, and that is our sustenance, and that is the sap in the vine, that is the moisture, that is the nutrients that we have. And then the cup is more than a nod towards, we will be pruned, and there will be winter, and it will be dry, and it will be hard, but we have taken the bread, and we will join Jesus in that suffering of journeying with ourselves and with others in difficult spaces and places. But I think, that 5 or 10 minutes on a Sunday morning, often, that is the moment where the abiding, just, we make that commitment again to abide. And I think that our symbols in communion point so much towards that John passage.
Who knew that Nick could not only build houses, but also can deliver a great Lenten talk? So what do we learn from Nick? Well, there was a few things that stood out to me, obviously. One was the obvious connections between his physical journey in the last few years of his life, and finding his whakapapa and finding his journey home to Waikawa, but the symbolicness of that in our journey of our Christian faith, the idea there of being welcomed with open arms, the welcome that we receive, and the welcome that Jesus gives to us as we find our way home, the sense of belonging and coming home, but the sense of we become more as we recognize the connections across our lives. Also, this idea of abiding, that we abide, and just by abiding, we find out who we truly are, who we were made to be. And we understand also that Jesus has been before us. In all of our families, I guarantee that if we look back in our family history, we would find Jesus' work in our lives. I can testify to my life and my family's life going back. I had no idea when I first came to faith that God had been working in my family before me. That was a bit of a shock, but it's true. God's been working in my family for generations in lots of different ways, and we can follow the handiwork of God in our lives and be encouraged by that as well. And I love that the last bit that Nick brought about the communion, and how communion reminds him of that deep abiding and being transformed in Jesus. And I thought that was so lovely how he brought us back around to what we celebrate every week in most of our gatherings, and how we can re-look at that through this lens. So hopefully, as you go to your studies, hopefully you'll find some things that God's been talking to you about.